The night Ray Mercer found them, the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees, and the highway was a black ribbon of ice cutting through nowhere. His headlight swept across something that stopped his blood cold. A baby stroller tipped sideways in a snowdrift, one wheel still spinning. And beside it, a young woman face down in the white, her arms stretched toward the stroller like she'd fallen reaching for it. The infant inside was screaming. Ray didn't think. He pulled off his club jacket, the one he'd bled for, the one that cost him everything, and wrapped that baby in leather and warmth, while the storm howled like it wanted all three of them dead. If you've ever wondered what a man does when the road gives him one last chance at redemption, stay until the end. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. The Harley had been running for 6 hours straight when Ray Mercer finally admitted to himself that he had no destination. He'd left Dayton before dawn, pulling out of the Iron Compass clubhouse lot while the sky was still the color of a bruise, before anyone was awake to ask him where he was going. That suited him fine. He didn't have an answer. He'd been riding this particular stretch of Route 9 through the flat, frozen spine of rural Ohio for the last 2 hours because the road didn't require anything from him. It just unrolled itself ahead of the headlight and let him move through it like a ghost passing through a wall. No friction, no demands, no one looking at his face. At 50, Ray Mercer's face was the kind that made people uneasy in diners. Not because it was ugly, it wasn't, exactly, but because it looked like it had been through something that faces weren't supposed to survive. The cheekbones were sharp and angular above a jaw that carried 3 days of gray stubble, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that gave nothing away. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth was old enough that it had settled into something permanent, something that looked almost architectural, like it had been there so long it was just part of the structure now. He'd stopped explaining it years ago. People who needed explanations weren't people he particularly wanted to talk to. He wore his Iron Compass vest over a black thermal, the patches faded and cracked from exposure. The vest was the heaviest thing on him, and not because of the leather. Every patch on it was a year. Every year was a mile. And somewhere underneath all of it, in a place he didn't examine often, was the weight of what those miles had been running from. The radio on the bike had stopped working outside of Zanesville, which was fine. He didn't need noise. He had the engine, a 2009 Road King that he'd rebuilt 3 times from near dead, the motor turning over with that low, rhythmic thunder that sat somewhere between a heartbeat and a warning. He'd tuned it himself over 100 different Saturdays in the clubhouse garage, and he knew its sound the way he used to know his own breathing in the dark. Steady, controlled, the kind of sound that said, "I am still here. I have not stopped yet." The snow started somewhere around mile marker 44. Not a warning, not a flurry, just suddenly there. Fat, lazy flakes that the headlight caught in slow motion, drifting down through the beam like they had no particular hurry about anything. Ray felt the temperature drop across his hands before he acknowledged what was happening, the cold working into the gaps between his gloves and his cuffs. He'd ridden in worse. He'd ridden in actual blizzards through the Appalachians, through Montana in November, through Texas ice storms that had turned the highway into a mirror. Cold was something he understood. Cold was honest. Cold told you exactly where you stood. He pulled his shoulders in slightly and dropped his speed to 40, feeling the tires read the road surface through the handlebars. Ice was different from wet. Ice had a particular silence to it, a smoothness that felt almost cooperative right up until the moment it wasn't. He'd learned that lesson the hard way at 32, sliding into a guardrail on Route 30 and lying in a ditch for 40 minutes before a trucker spotted him. That was the year before everything else happened, back when he still thought the worst thing that could ever occur to him had already occurred. The road ahead curved gently to the left, following the line of a dried creek bed that was now buried under 2 feet of snow. On his right, a line of bare-boned oaks stood up out of the white like sentinels, their branches clicking against each other in the wind. Everything was extraordinarily quiet, except for the engine and the snow working against the ground. No other headlights. No farmhouse lights visible through the tree line. Just the dark and the white and the sound of his own movement through it. He almost didn't catch it in time. His headlight swept the curve, and for a fraction of a second it passed over something that didn't belong to the landscape, A dark shape on the right shoulder, something at the wrong height to be a deer, wrong shape to be a mailbox. His brain processed it a half second after his hands had already begun moving, squeezing the brake with the careful, controlled pressure of a man who understood ice. The Harley slowed. He brought it to a rolling stop on the shoulder and sat there with the engine idling, looking at what the light was showing him. The stroller was a cheap umbrella fold, the kind that costs $30 at a discount store, dark blue fabric now saturated with snow, tipped at a 45-degree angle where one wheel had gone off the edge of the shoulder into the shallow gutter. It was still moving slightly, one wheel spinning just barely in the wind. And from inside it, a sound that worked on a frequency below hearing, below thought, a sound that bypassed every defensive structure Ray Mercer had built over 20 years and hit him somewhere animal and unprotected. An infant, screaming. He was off the bike before he knew he'd made a decision, kickstand down, engine still running, crossing the shoulder in 4 long strides. The woman was 3 feet from the stroller, face down in the snow, her right arm extended toward it, her fingers still curved in the shape of a grip. She'd fallen reaching for it. She was wearing a thin-down jacket over what looked like scrubs. Hospital scrubs, pale green, completely inappropriate for this temperature. And she had no hat, no gloves, her dark hair spread out in the snow around her face like she'd been put there deliberately. Ray dropped to one knee beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Pulse. Slow and thready, but there. "Hey!" His voice came out rougher than he intended, the word dropping into the storm like a stone. "Hey! Wake up!" Nothing. He assessed her in seconds the way the Army had trained him to assess things. Airway, breathing, circulation, injury. Her breathing was shallow but present. No visible blood. The way she'd fallen suggested she'd gone down suddenly, not been hit. Medical. Something medical had happened to her out here alone, on a road that hadn't seen another car in the 30 minutes he'd been riding it. He stood, crossed to the stroller, and looked down at the baby. She was maybe 3 months old, maybe 4, wrapped in a pink fleece sleeper that had come partially unsnapped at the bottom, her feet now exposed to the air. She was screaming with her whole body, face red and scrunched, tiny fists clenched at her cheeks. She was cold, not hypothermic yet, too much fury in her for that, but getting there. The temperature was in free fall and the snow was thickening. Ray did not think about what he did next. Thinking would have taken too long. He unzipped his iron compass vest, pulled it off, and wrapped it around the baby. All of it, the leather, the patches, the 15 years of miles, tucking it around her the way he'd watched his wife tuck a blanket around their daughter once, a long time ago in a different world. The baby stopped screaming for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to look up at him with eyes that had no fear in them yet, because she was too young to know she should be afraid. Then she started again, quieter now. A working cry rather than a panic cry, the kind that meant she was cold and hungry and confused but not dying. "I know," Ray said quietly. "I know. Give me a minute." He lifted the woman from the snow with both arms, getting one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees, and she was lighter than she should have been. The kind of light that suggested she hadn't been eating enough for a while. The kind of light that had a story attached to it. He carried her to the bike and understood immediately that this was not a situation with good options. He couldn't call 911. He checked his phone outside Zanesville and found no signal, which hadn't mattered then and mattered a great deal now. He couldn't leave the woman here and ride for help. He couldn't leave the baby here. He made the only calculation available to him. He positioned himself on the bike with the unconscious woman held against his chest and his left arm around her, then set the baby in the sling of the vest across his torso, tucking her in against the warmth of his body, feeling her small weight settle against his sternum. It was not safe. It was not advisable. He understood both of these things completely and started the engine anyway, because the alternative was watching 2 people die in a ditch on Route 9, and that was not something he was willing to do. He rode. Not fast. 15 miles an hour, sometimes less, reading the road through the tires and his gut and 30 years of experience. The baby had quieted against his chest, her cheek against his thermal shirt, her breath coming in small, visible puffs in the cold air. The woman's head had fallen against his shoulder. He could feel her pulse through the contact, irregular, worrying. He kept his eyes on the road and thought about nothing except the road. He found the clinic 8 miles south on Route 9, Coldwater Community Medical, a converted storefront building with fluorescent lights bleeding out through ice-crusted windows and a hand-painted sign that had been there since the 90s. It was not a hospital. It had maybe 6 beds and a staff that ran on exhaustion and community grants. But it had lights on at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in January, which was the only thing that mattered. Ray brought the bike to a stop in the handicap space by the front door, which was as much care as he had left for regulations, and carried the woman inside with the baby still against his chest, pushing through the glass door with his shoulder. The nurse at the front desk looked up from whatever she was reading, and her face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 1 second: surprise, wariness, and the particular kind of assessment that people who worked in small-town medical facilities applied to unscheduled arrivals in the middle of winter nights. She looked at the unconscious woman in his arms. She looked at the infant. She looked at Ray. 6'2", gray stubble, scar, no jacket, tattoos visible on both forearms below the rolled-up thermal. "I found them on Route 9, Ray said. "She was unconscious in the snow. The baby's cold. She needs to be seen now." The nurse was already moving, which was the thing he'd needed from her, whatever her face thought of the picture he made. She called something back over her shoulder, and a second nurse appeared from the hallway, and then there was the efficient, practiced motion of people who knew how to take an emergency and organize it. They took the woman from him onto a gurney. They took the baby. Ray stood in the middle of the waiting room with his arms empty and his thermal damp from the snow and cold seeping through him now that he wasn't moving. A third person appeared from the hallway. A doctor, by the look of her, somewhere in her 40s, short hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been on since morning. She took in Ray's appearance with a clinical directness that he appreciated. Not judgment, just information gathering. "You're the one who found them?" "Yes." "Any idea how long they were out there?" "I can't say. Road's been quiet. At least the time it took for her core temp to drop enough to lose consciousness." The doctor nodded, already turning. "You hurt?" Ray considered his hands, reddened, stiffening from cold but functional. "No." "Sit down before you fall down." She disappeared back into the hallway. Ray didn't sit down. He stood by the window and watched the snow coming down through the parking lot lights and tried to locate something inside himself that felt like relief. He found something closer to the quiet that came after a decision had been made. Not peace, exactly, but the absence of the particular tension that preceded action. He'd acted. Whatever happened next was no longer entirely in his hands. He found his vest on the counter near the triage desk, someone having unwrapped it from the baby and set it aside. He picked it up and held it without putting it back on, running his thumbs over the patches the way you might read Braille. Iron Compass MC. Dayton. Chapter: Road Captain. The patches were a kind of autobiography, if you knew how to read them. Most people in this building didn't, and what they thought they knew wasn't accurate. The nurse who'd been at the desk, younger than he'd clocked initially, maybe late 20s, with the wide-open face of someone who hadn't yet learned how to be professionally neutral, kept finding reasons to be in his peripheral vision without quite coming close enough to speak. He'd noticed this pattern before. He was used to it. He waited. Are you in a motorcycle club?" she finally asked, from approximately 8 feet away. "Yes." "Like an outlaw club?" He looked at her directly. She held her ground, which he noted. "I'm in the Iron Compass. We're a veterans club. We ride charity events and do community support work, and occasionally we find people unconscious in snowstorms." He paused. "The leather's for the cold. The tattoos are for the same reason as everyone else's. Something to look at when the mirror's empty." She blinked. Didn't respond to that last part. "Okay," she said after a moment, and returned to her desk, though she kept looking at him. The clock on the wall read 11:47. Ray found a plastic chair against the wall and sat down in it with his forearms on his knees and his vest hanging from one hand, and he waited. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him at their particular frequency. The heater in the corner pushed out air that smelled of recycled warmth and industrial cleaner. Through the window, the snow kept falling steadily, without any particular urgency. He thought about the baby's face, the way she'd looked up at him for those 3 seconds before starting to cry again. The absolute, uncomplicated trust in it. Not trust exactly, because she was too young to have formulated anything as complex as trust. Just the absence of suspicion. Just openness to whatever the world offered next. He hadn't felt a face look at him like that in 15 years. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and stayed there for a moment, in the dark behind his palms. He did not think about his daughter. He actively chose not to think about his daughter, which was the same process he undertook approximately 11 times a day, every day, and which never entirely worked. The doctor came back at 12:15 with an update she delivered with the economy of someone used to talking to people who were holding themselves together through willpower alone. The woman, no ID on her yet, had experienced a syncopal episode, likely brought on by exhaustion, dehydration, and what appeared to be acute stress response. Her core temperature had been low, but not dangerously so. She was warming. She would be stable by morning. The infant was underweight but otherwise healthy and had been fed and was currently sleeping in the nursery. "She's going to be okay," Ray said. "Looks like." The doctor regarded him with the same clinical directness as before. "You saved her life, you understand that. Both of them." Ray didn't respond to that. "Is there someone we should call for you? Someone who knows where you are?" "I'm fine." "You've been sitting in a cold waiting room in a wet shirt for an hour and a half." "I've sat in worse places." She looked at him for another moment, the particular look of a medical professional deciding how much to push, then produced a gray institutional blanket from somewhere and set it on the chair beside him without comment and went back down the hallway. Ray put the blanket over his shoulders, mostly because refusing it felt like an unnecessary statement. He stared at the floor, which was linoleum in a pattern that had been designed in approximately 1987 and had not been updated since. He listened to the building breathe around him, the hum of the generator, the tick of the heating pipes, the occasional shuffle of footsteps from behind the doors that separated the waiting room from wherever the real work happened. At 1:40 in the morning, he fell asleep in the chair. It was not a decision. His body simply reached a threshold and crossed it. He dreamed about the road. Not a specific road, but the abstract concept of it. The way it looked from a moving bike, the lines disappearing beneath you, the horizon always reforming itself at exactly the distance of visibility. In the dream, something was wrong with the horizon. It kept folding, the way a piece of paper folds when you push both ends toward the middle. He kept riding toward it, and it kept folding, and somewhere behind him there was a sound he recognized and refused to turn toward. He woke at 4:12 to the sound of voices. Not loud voices, careful voices. The kind that people use when they're trying not to be heard, but are too upset to be entirely quiet. He oriented himself in seconds. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floor, plastic chair, blanket, the smell of industrial cleaner, and located the voices as coming from the direction of the triage desk. The nurse from earlier was speaking in a low, tight tone to a man in a dark overcoat. Behind the man stood a woman in a charcoal suit, perfectly put together in a way that looked absurd at 4 in the morning in a rural clinic, and beside her, a second man who had the particular build and expression of professional security. The man in the overcoat was speaking to the nurse with the careful, modulated authority of someone accustomed to having institutions respond to him. He was holding a folder. Ray did not move. He watched through half-closed eyes, keeping his breathing even. "Minor child currently under your care," the man in the overcoat was saying. "My clients have legal documentation establishing—" "Sir, it's 4 in the morning," the nurse said. Her voice had found a steadiness that hadn't been there earlier. "Whatever documentation you have, the appropriate time to present it is as soon as possible. The child's well-being is our primary—" "The child is sleeping." A pause. "We'll wait," the woman in the charcoal suit said. It was the first time she'd spoken, and her voice had no warmth in it at all. The kind of voice that had learned very early that warmth was a resource to be deployed strategically rather than freely given. Ray sat up in the plastic chair, and the blanket fell from his shoulders, and the man in the overcoat turned at the movement and looked at him. The man's assessment was very fast and very thorough. He took in the vest, the tattoos, the scar. The way Ray was sitting in a clinic waiting room at 4 in the morning, and his expression rearranged itself into something that was not quite contempt, but was first cousin to it. "Can we help you?" the woman in the charcoal suit asked, in the tone that people use when they mean precisely the opposite. Ray said nothing. He was looking at the folder in the man in the overcoat's hand. He was looking at the way the woman in the charcoal suit's eyes had gone to the hallway that led to the nursery when she first came in, a fast, involuntary flicker, like something on a leash. "Sir," the man said, "this is a private matter." Ray said. He stood up, folded the blanket, set it on the chair, and walked to the water fountain at the end of the waiting room with the unhurried pace of a man who belonged exactly where he was. He drank water. He stood there with his back to the room and listened to the renewed low conversation behind him and thought about the way the woman's eyes had moved to that hallway. He thought about a young woman in hospital scrubs lying face down in the snow on a road with no houses and no lights, 8 miles from the nearest town, in the middle of the night. He thought about the folder. He thought about the word legal. He turned back around. The man and woman and their security presence had arranged themselves in the waiting room chairs with the settled quality of people prepared to wait indefinitely. The man in the overcoat was speaking quietly into his phone. The woman in the charcoal suit was looking at her own phone with an expression of concentrated patience. Ray went to the triage desk. The nurse looked up at him with an expression that had multiple things happening in it simultaneously. Relief that he'd returned to her orbit, wariness about what he was going to say, and something that looked almost like a request. "Who are they?" Ray asked, quietly enough that only she could hear. She glanced toward the waiting room. "They say they have a court order, surrogacy agreement. They claim the baby is—" She stopped. "They have a lot of paperwork." "What's the mother's name?" She hesitated. "I'm the one who carried her in here," Ray said. "I was there when she fell." The nurse looked at him for another moment. "Marina," she said. "Marina Hale." Ray nodded. He looked at the hallway that led to the patient rooms. He looked at the waiting room. He looked at the clock, which read 4:18. "Is she awake?" "She was, about 20 minutes ago. She was asking about the baby." "Does she know they're here?" The nurse's expression answered the question before she did. "No." Ray picked up his vest from where he'd left it on the counter and put it back on. He felt the familiar weight of it settle across his shoulders, the leather, the patches, the accumulated miles, and something in him that had been slightly off-center for the past few hours found its footing. "Which room?" he said. The nurse looked at the people in the waiting room. She looked at Ray. She made a decision that was visible in the slight shift of her posture, a decision that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the specific instinct that medical workers develop over years of seeing who walks through their doors and what they carry with them. She wrote a room number on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter. Ray took it without looking at it and walked down the hall. Room 4 was at the end of a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and old building, the kind of smell that existed underneath the surface of every medical facility, regardless of how recently it had been cleaned. The door was partially open, the light inside turned low. He knocked twice with his knuckle, softly, and pushed the door open enough to look in. Marina Hale was sitting up in the hospital bed, which surprised him. He'd expected to find her lying down, recovering, the particular horizontal quality of someone who'd been through something and was being managed by it. Instead, she was sitting with her back against the headboard and her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and she was staring at the window with the expression of someone working through something that had too many moving parts to track. She was younger than he'd been able to tell from the snow and the dark. Mid-20s, maybe. Dark circles under her eyes that spoke of longer than one bad night. The scrubs she'd been wearing had been replaced by a clinic gown, and her dark hair was still damp at the ends. She turned when he pushed the door open and he watched her body respond before her face did. A full-body flinch, the particular startled response of someone whose nervous system had been running on threat assessment for a while. Then she saw him, really saw him. The vest, the face, the careful way he was standing in her doorway, not coming in, not going away, just there. "You're the one who found us," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." A silence. She looked at him with something working behind her eyes that he couldn't immediately identify. The baby's okay? She's in the nursery, sleeping. They said she's fine. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them. There are people here, aren't there? It wasn't a question either. Yes. The Sterlings. He didn't recognize the name but filed it. A man in an overcoat with a folder, a woman in a suit, one security guy. Marina's arms tightened around her knees. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, the kind of sound people make when something they've been dreading finally arrives, and the dread is almost a relief because at least the waiting is over. How long have they been here? Maybe 15 minutes? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall against the window, the flakes visible in the parking lot lights. I need you to understand something, she said, and her voice had changed. It had gotten quieter and more careful, the way voices do when people are choosing their words not because they're trying to deceive, but because they know exactly how what they're about to say is going to land. I know what you see when you look at me right now. Sick woman in a hospital. Paperwork outside says something different. And I know how that looks. Ray said nothing. He was listening. That baby out there, Marina said, is my daughter. I carried her for 9 months. She came out of my body. Her name is Emma. Her jaw was tight. Grant and Evelyn Sterling paid me $60,000 to carry a baby for them because Evelyn can't carry to term. That was the agreement. Clinical, legal, clean. She looked at the window. Except 4 months into the pregnancy, I found out the genetic material they used wasn't what they told me. The biological father isn't Grant Sterling. They sourced material without my consent. They changed the agreement. And when I tried to talk to them about it, their lawyers sent me a letter that basically said I didn't have the right to care. She stopped. The room held its breath. I ran it 7 months, she said. I know, I signed papers. I know exactly what this looks like legally, but that's my daughter, and they don't want her because they love her. They want her because she's property to them, and they don't lose what they've decided is theirs. Ray stood in the doorway of room 4 in a clinic on Route 9 in the middle of an Ohio winter and looked at Marina Hale's face and thought about a folder full of legal paperwork and a woman in a charcoal suit whose eyes had moved to a nursery hallway before she'd said a single word. He thought about what it meant to have the law in your folder and the money to make the law mean whatever you needed it to mean. He thought about a baby wrapped in a leather vest on a frozen road. He thought about 15 years of riding away from something he hadn't been able to stop. Their names are Grant and Evelyn Sterling, he said. Yes. You said Sterling. You know them. He didn't, but the name sat in his chest with a particular weight, the kind of weight that names acquired when you'd spent enough time around the machinery of money and power, and what that machinery did to people who didn't have either. No, he said. But I know the type. He looked at her for a moment longer. I'm going to go back to the waiting room, he said. Don't let anyone through that door who doesn't work here. You understand? Marina looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't quite been able to before, taking in the whole picture. The vest, the scar, the gray eyes, the particular quality of stillness that men carry when they've been in places where stillness was the difference between alive and not. Why are you doing this? She asked, not suspicious, genuinely asking, like she needed the answer. Ray thought about it, thought about Route 9 and the spinning wheel and the sound of an infant in a snowstorm. Thought about the man he'd been 15 years ago and the man he'd been unable to prevent himself from becoming in the years since. Thought about what it meant to be handed something by a road that had been asking nothing of him for 2 decades. I found you, he said. That's enough reason. He pulled the door almost closed behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment, one hand on the wall, the hum of the building around him, the fluorescent lights doing their steady, impartial work. Down the hall, in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and overnight hours, 2 people sat with a folder full of documents and the patient certainty of people who had never in their lives been told no by anything that counted. Ray Mercer rolled his neck once, heard the crack of it, and started walking back toward the waiting room. He didn't know yet what Grant and Evelyn Sterling had in that folder. He didn't know what connections they had, what judges they knew, what version of the law they'd purchased. He didn't know what the morning was going to look like when the real machinery of money and institutional authority began to turn. What he knew was the name on that folder. What he knew was the way a woman in a charcoal suit looked at a nursery hallway. What he knew was that he had his phone, and his phone had numbers in it that went back 20 years, and some of those numbers belonged to men who knew things about things. Men who'd spent careers in courtrooms and investigators' offices and the particular unglamorous trenches where power was actually contested. What he knew was that somewhere in this building, in a room with a glass window, a baby named Emma was sleeping wrapped in warmth, and her mother was sitting with her knees to her chest in a hospital gown, working out how to survive the morning. He was almost to the waiting room door when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A number he didn't recognize. A 614 area code, Columbus. He stood there in the hallway looking at it buzz and thought about what it meant that someone in Columbus was calling him at 4:23 in the morning. He answered. "Who is this?" he said. Not a question, a statement. There was a silence on the other end, then a voice, male, older, controlled in the way of someone managing something large. "Is this the man who brought Marina Hale to the clinic on Route 9? Ray's hand tightened on the phone. "Who's asking?" he said. Another pause, longer this time. When the voice came back, something in it had shifted, a degree of calculation, of weight. "My name isn't important right now. What's important is that you understand you walked into something tonight that is considerably larger than a woman and a baby in the snow. And whether you walk back out of it depends entirely on what you decide to do in the next few hours." Ray looked at the door to the waiting room. He could see through the small window in it, the man in the overcoat still on his phone. The woman in the charcoal suit still waiting. "I'm listening," Ray said. But the line had already gone dead. The line was dead, and the hallway was still, and Ray stood there with the phone at his side, and the particular silence of a man who has just been handed a problem that doesn't have a shape yet. He looked at the number again. 614. Columbus. He hit redial and got 3 rings and then a generic voicemail message. Not a name, not a business, just the robotic recitation of the number itself and the instruction to leave a message. He didn't. He stood there a moment longer, and then he put the phone in his pocket and looked at the door to the waiting room and made a decision he hadn't consciously arrived at, but which was already complete by the time he acknowledged it. He went back to the triage desk. The nurse, her name tag read Kelsey, he noticed for the first time, looked up at him with the expression of someone who had been hoping he'd come back and wasn't sure what to do with the relief of it. "The people in the waiting room," Ray said, keeping his voice level and low. "Have they asked to see the baby?" "The man said they'd wait for the doctor to come on shift at 6. And the woman's file, Marina's chart. Who has access to that?" Kelsey glanced at the door. "Legally, her medical information is protected. They can't—" "I know what they can't do legally," Ray said. "I'm asking who in this building they might have already spoken to." Kelsey's expression shifted in a way that told him everything he needed to know before she said anything. A slight drawing in around the mouth. The look of someone recalling a conversation they hadn't quite known was significant until right now. "The night administrator," she said carefully. "When they first came in, before I was at the desk. He spoke to them for a few minutes in the back office." Ray nodded. "Who's the administrator tonight?" "Carl Purcell, but he's—" She stopped. "He's been with this clinic for 12 years. He wouldn't—" "I'm not saying he would," Ray said. "I'm saying money talks in a language that sounds a lot like helpfulness." He left her with that and went to the men's room at the end of the hall. He turned on the cold water and put both hands under it and then pressed his wet palms against his face and held them there for 10 seconds, feeling the cold work against the underside of his eyes. He straightened and looked at himself in the mirror. The gray stubble, the scar, the pale eyes with the specific flatness that had developed in them somewhere around year 3 of riding alone, the flatness of a man who had stopped expecting the mirror to show him something he recognized. He pulled his phone back out, scrolled past the unknown Columbus number and found the one he was looking for. He'd had it for 4 years and only called it twice. Both times it had picked up on the second ring. It picked up on the second ring now. "It's Ray Mercer." He listened to the breathing on the other end, measured, the breathing of a man who was not startled by phone calls in the small hours of the morning. I need you to run a name for me. Elias Grant said, "What time is it?" 4:30. It's 4:30. I know what time it is, Elias. A pause. The sound of movement. A man sitting up in bed. The particular sounds of a house at night adjusting around a waking body. Elias Grant was 61 years old, a retired legal investigator who'd spent 20 years with the state AG's office before a disagreement about institutional priorities had ended his official career and redirected his skill set into work that was more selective and considerably less regulated. He was also a veteran, a former Army JAG paralegal, and the kind of man who, when Ray Mercer called him at 4:30 in the morning, asked what time it was exactly once before getting to work. "Name," Elias said. "Sterling. Grant and Evelyn Sterling. I need whatever you can find. Assets, litigation history, anything involving surrogacy arrangements or fertility contracts, business interests, anything about a woman named Marina Hale." The scratch of a pen on paper. "Where are you?" "Coldwater Community Medical on Route 9, about 8 miles south of Elmore." "You in trouble?" Ray thought about that specific question in its specific context. "Not yet," he said, "but there are people here with paperwork, and in my experience, that's the early stage of trouble. Give me a few hours." "I don't have a few hours. The doctor changes shift at 6. "Then give me what I need." Ray gave him what he had: the name, the folder, the charcoal suit, the security presence, the specific quality of the woman's voice when she'd asked if she could help him. He gave him the Columbus number that had called and died. He gave him Marina's account of the surrogacy arrangement in the compressed, factual way he'd absorbed it: the altered genetic material, the changed agreement, the lawyer's letter, the flight at 7 months. Elias was quiet for a moment after the recitation. Then, "Ray?" "Yeah." "If what you're describing is accurate, these people didn't just breach a contract. What you're describing is systematic. That's not a couple of rich people who got impatient. That's a structure." Ray said nothing. "I'll call you at 5:45, Elias said. "Don't let anything move before then." The line went dead, and Ray stood in the men's room with the cold water still running and the mirror still showing him the same face it always showed him, and thought about the word structure. About what it meant that someone in Columbus had his number and knew he was at a clinic on Route 9 before he'd told anyone. About what kind of structure required that level of reach. He turned off the water, dried his hands on paper towels, opened the door. The man from the waiting room was standing in the hallway. Not the security presence. The man in the overcoat. Up close, he was somewhere in his late 40s, well-maintained in the way of men who spent significant money on appearing effortlessly maintained, silver at the temples, a face that had learned to arrange itself into expressions of reasonable concern. He was holding the folder at his side and looking at Ray with the particular assessment of a man who had identified a variable he hadn't accounted for. "I don't believe we've met," the man said. He extended a hand. "Curtis Adler. I represent Grant and Evelyn Sterling." Ray looked at the hand. Didn't take it. "Attorney?" "That's right." "At 4:30 in the morning. My clients are very committed to the welfare of their child." "Their child," Ray said. Something moved behind Adler's eyes. A flicker of recalibration. The kind that happened when a variable proved more complicated than anticipated. "The child named in our contract, yes. We understand there's been a medical situation tonight, and we're certainly sensitive to that. But the legal framework here is very clear, and the sooner we can—" "What's the baby's name?" Ray said. Adler stopped. "I'm sorry?" "The baby. Your client's child. What's her name?" A pause that lasted a half-second too long. "The naming rights are—" "I'm not asking about naming rights. I'm asking what they call her." Ray looked at him evenly. "You've been here 45 minutes working to take custody of a child. I'm asking if you know her name." Adler's face rearranged itself into something more careful. "I don't think that's relevant to the legal—" "No," Ray said. "You're right. It's not." He moved past Adler with the measured pace of a man who had decided to stop engaging. "Excuse me." He felt Adler's attention on his back as he walked. He didn't turn around. He went back to the triage desk and found Kelsey in conversation with another nurse who'd come on for a supplementary overnight shift. Older, heavy-set, with the compressed pragmatism of someone who'd been doing this work for long enough that very little surprised her anymore. Her name tag read Diane. She looked at Ray with the professional neutrality that Kelsey hadn't quite mastered yet. "You the one who brought her in?" Diane said. "Yes." "Biker." "Biker," he confirmed. Diane looked at him for another moment in the way of someone doing a rapid calculation. "She asked about you, the woman in room 4, about 20 minutes after you walked away the first time." "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were still here." Ray absorbed that. "I'm still here," he said. Diane nodded once, the nod of a woman who had seen enough situations to know which ones required the particular kind of presence that couldn't be explained by any official category. She went back to her paperwork. At 5:10, the dynamic in the waiting room shifted. Ray became aware of it before he could identify the cause. A change in pressure, the way a room changes when the attention in it reorganizes around something new. He was in the plastic chair again, his back to the wall, and he had been watching the waiting room the way you watch a card game you're not playing, tracking positions, reading the tells, cataloging what each person's body was doing. The security presence had been checking his phone at measured intervals. Adler had returned from the hallway and was in quiet conversation with the woman in the charcoal suit, who Ray now understood was Evelyn Sterling herself, because the way she listened to Adler was the way people listened to someone they were paying to manage a problem, with a concentration that was all about outcome and nothing about the person speaking. The shift happened when Evelyn Sterling looked at her phone and stood up. It was a different quality of standing than before. Before she had been waiting, now she was activating. She said something to Adler, very low, very brief, and Adler straightened in a way that telegraphed response to directive rather than colleague-level reaction. The security man put his own phone away and repositioned himself near the entrance. Ray's phone buzzed, a text from Elias. 30 minutes earlier than planned. Call me. He stepped outside. The cold hit him hard and clean, the air dry and sharp enough to make his eyes water. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the parking lot was buried under a uniform white. His bike standing in the handicap space like a black monument, the only thing in the lot that hadn't been softened by accumulation. The temperature had to be single digits. His breath came in visible bursts. He called Elias. "Talk fast," Ray said. "Sterling." Elias's voice had a quality Ray had heard in it twice before, a tightness, the sound of a man who had found something larger than he'd expected and was deciding how to hold it. Grant Sterling, 53, Evelyn Sterling, 49. Address of record is Dublin, Ohio. Net worth estimated liquid assets, we're talking north of 40 million. Grant Sterling is managing partner at Sterling Meridian, which is a private equity firm specializing in healthcare and biotech investment. "Healthcare," Ray said. "Healthcare, which includes fertility clinics. He has equity stakes in 3 of them in Ohio and 1 in Indiana. Now, Marina Hale, 26. She came up in a civil database I have access to through a colleague. She was a plaintiff in a contract dispute filed 14 months ago in Franklin County. The case was dismissed, sealed. Sealed how? Settlement. Confidential. But the filing, before it was sealed, listed co-plaintiffs, plural, 3 other women. Ray stood in the parking lot with the cold working through his thermal and felt something that he recognized as the specific sensation of a problem clarifying from fog into geometry. 3 other women, he repeated. 3 other women who had entered into surrogacy contracts with entities connected through shell companies to Sterling Meridian. The case alleged contract fraud, coercion, and unauthorized alteration of genetic material. It was filed. It made a splash in a Franklin County clerk's office for about 3 weeks, and then it went away. Very clean, very fast. And the women. 2 of them dropped their claims. One of them, Elias paused in a way that had weight. One of them left Ohio. She's in Oregon now, from what I can find. She doesn't have any presence online. Nothing. For a 29-year-old woman in 2024, no social media presence means someone made a decision. Ray looked at the clinic door. Through the glass, he could see the waiting room, the back of Evelyn Sterling's head, the overcoat of Curtis Adler. "There's more," Elias said. "I know. The Columbus number that called you, I ran it. It's a burner, but the cell tower ping puts it in the Hilliard area, which is western Columbus. Sterling Meridian has an office in Hilliard. The cold air pressed against Ray's face, and he stood there with it and let that sit. Someone from inside their own operation called you, Elias said. Someone who knew you'd found Marina and knew where you were. Or someone who's watching their operation from the outside and wanted me to know what I'd walked into. Either way, Elias said, you have a problem. These people have a sealed court case and $40 million and a lawyer at a rural clinic at 5 in the morning. Whatever Marina signed, they're going to use it. And whatever judge they've already called, how fast can you get here? Silence. Then, Ray? I know. I'm 3 hours away at best. Then start driving. He paused. Whatever you have, the Franklin County filing, the co-plaintiffs, the shell company structure, can you get it into a form that a physician could look at in the next hour? You think the doctor's going to... I think the doctor has a professional obligation to understand what she's releasing a patient into, Ray said. And I think if she reads what you're about to send me, she's going to have questions that nobody in that waiting room is going to be able to answer cleanly. Elias breathed out. All right. Email? Ray gave him his email address and hung up and stood in the parking lot for another minute with his face to the cold and his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the sky, which was beginning, barely, imperceptibly, to lighten at the eastern edge. Not dawn, just the first suggestion that dawn was theoretically possible. The parking lot was completely still. The snow held the silence the way snow always held silence, absorbing sound, creating a stillness that was almost tactile. He thought about the 3 women, the 2 who'd dropped their claims, the one who'd disappeared to Oregon and left no footprint. He thought about Marina Hale in a thin down jacket, running at 7 months pregnant. He went back inside. The situation in the waiting room had advanced in the 5 minutes he'd been outside. The doctor was present now. She'd been called early, apparently, and she was standing near the desk in her coat with her hair still showing the specific flatness of someone who'd driven fast without time to address it, and she was looking at documents that Curtis Adler was presenting from the folder. Her expression was the careful neutrality of a professional encountering something she needed to understand before she could react to it. Ray went directly to her. Adler intercepted. Sir, this is a private doctor. Ray spoke around Adler to the woman. My name is Ray Mercer. I'm the person who found Marina Hale and her daughter on Route 9. I have information about the parties presenting that paperwork that you should have before you make any decisions. The doctor, her name, he now saw, was Dr. Sarah Vance, looked at him with the rapid assessment she'd applied to him earlier, and something in that assessment had updated since their last conversation. She had been awake long enough and seen enough of the situation to have developed an opinion, and whatever opinion she'd developed had made her receptive. Mr. Mercer, Adler began. Curtis? Evelyn Sterling's voice from the chairs was quiet and precise. Let him speak. The way she said it was more interesting than anything Adler had done, because it was confident in a way that suggested she had no concern about what Ray might say. She was watching him with the cool attention of someone who had dealt with variables before and understood how to contain them. She was 49 and looked 40 in the surgical way of women who had spent significant money on looking 40, and her eyes were very pale, lighter than Ray's even, and they were absolutely still. I've been in contact with a legal investigator this morning, Ray said, keeping his eyes on Dr. Vance. I have documentation that I'd like you to look at before any transfer decisions are made. It relates to a civil case in Franklin County involving 3 other women and contracts connected to the same parties. Dr. Vance's eyes didn't move to Adler or to Evelyn Sterling. She looked at Ray. Do you have the documentation now? It's being sent to my phone in the next few minutes. Then we can speak in my office. She turned to Adler. The legal process doesn't accelerate because of inconvenience. Marina Hale is my patient and that child is in my care. Nothing moves in the next hour without my direct authorization. She looked at Evelyn Sterling with the specific expression of a woman who had been managing other people's attempts to override her professional judgment for 30 years. I'm sure you understand. Evelyn Sterling looked back at her with an expression that had no warmth and no aggression and was simply waiting. Of course, she said. Dr. Vance's office was small and organized with the precision of a limited space used intensively. Files in labeled rows, a desk that held exactly what was needed, and nothing decorative except one framed photograph turned at an angle that made it visible only from her chair. She sat behind it, and Ray sat across from her, and he pulled up his email on his phone, and they went through what Elias had sent. It took 20 minutes. Dr. Vance read with the focused concentration of a woman who had learned to absorb significant information under pressure, and she asked 2 questions and did not express her reactions until the end, when she set Ray's phone down on the desk between them and sat back and said nothing for a measured moment. "If this is accurate," she said finally, "the source is a retired investigator from the state AG's office. 20 years, he's not in the business of inaccuracy." The sealed case. Sealed by settlement. 3 other women. Identical pattern to what Marina described to me. Dr. Vance looked at the phone, looked at the framed photograph on her desk that Ray still couldn't see, looked at the window which was beginning to show the gray pre-dawn of a January morning in Ohio. "I can't hold them indefinitely," she said. "The documentation they have is legally executed. A surrogacy contract registered in Franklin County. If there's a court order, there isn't one yet. Adler said they'd wait for you to come on shift. They're working this through institutional pressure, not legal order. They're counting on the paperwork intimidating the situation into compliance." "Which it usually does," she said, without self-pity, just observation. "Yes," Ray said. She looked at him again with that clinical directness. "Who are you exactly, Mr. Mercer?" "I found 2 people in a snowstorm and called in a legal investigator at 4 in the morning and spent the night in my waiting room." "Yes." "Why?" Ray thought about Marina's question from room 4. "Why are you doing this?" And gave Dr. Vance the same answer, condensed. "Because I was there, and because I've seen what happens when people with resources decide that someone without them doesn't have the right to say no." Dr. Vance looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I need to examine Marina before anything else. I'll speak to the parties in the waiting room, and I'll tell them that my patient's medical status requires evaluation before any transfer of the minor can be considered. That gives us," she calculated, "maybe 2 hours before they start making calls to people with more authority than me. 2 hours is what I need." She stood. "Stay here for now. I'll have Kelsey bring you coffee. You look like you need it." She left. Ray sat in her office with his phone and the email from Elias and the growing weight of a morning that was accelerating toward him, and he did the thing he did when a situation required thinking rather than action. He sat completely still and let it all move through him. He called Elias again. "What else?" "I'm in my car," Elias said, road noise in the background. "I've been driving since we hung up." "Tell me about Grant Sterling specifically." "Grant Sterling is... Look, he's a smart man. He made his money legitimately in private equity, which is its own conversation. But the fertility clinic investments, that's where it gets textured. I found a piece in a Columbus Business Journal from 3 years ago. Profile piece, puff piece mostly. But there's a line in it. Journalist asked him about the personal dimension of the investment. Sterling said, the sound of papers, "We believe every family deserves the completion they're seeking. We're committed to making that happen at whatever cost." Ray said nothing. "At whatever cost," Elias repeated. In context, the journalist took it as corporate language. I'm reading it differently. "He can't have children," Ray said. "Or she can't. And for a man like that, that's not something you accept. That's something you solve. And if the solution doesn't stay solved, you apply more solution." Ray looked at the door. He knows about the 3 women. He was party to the settlements that sealed the case. He absolutely knows. Which means he knows the pattern is documented somewhere. Which means he knows the risk of Marina's story getting out. "Ray," Elias's voice dropped a register. "If these people are willing to reach into a clinic waiting room at 5 in the morning with a lawyer and security, they're not operating at the level of hoping it stays quiet. They're operating at the level of ensuring it." The word ensuring sat in the air. "How far out are you?" Ray said. 2.5 hours, maybe less. I know a judge in Sandusky County. Retired, but she still has contacts. If I can get her on the phone before 8, call her now." Ray, it's 5:30. Call her now, Elias. A pause. Then, all right. Ray put the phone away and sat with the hum of the building around him and the smell of coffee that someone was making somewhere and the gray light pressing against the window. And he thought about what insuring looked like. He thought about the Columbus number, about someone inside or near Sterling's operation who had called him specifically, which meant they knew who he was, which meant someone had looked at a tattoo or a vest or a license plate on a Harley in a clinic parking lot and connected it to a name inside of 40 minutes. That was not the footprint of a wealthy couple who wanted their baby. That was infrastructure. He needed to make another call. He hadn't wanted to make this call since the moment the situation had become a situation, because making this call meant bringing in weight that he couldn't entirely control once it moved, and because the conversation was going to require him to say things he hadn't said out loud to any member of the Iron Compass in 4 years. He made the call. It rang 5 times, which was unusual. Then a voice that sounded like gravel being processed, thick with sleep and something older than sleep. "You better be dying," Vic Tarr said. "I need the club," Ray said. A silence that had a very specific texture. Not surprise exactly, but the quality of a man recalibrating his understanding of a morning he'd thought was going to be simple. "Where are you?" Vic said. "Coldwater Medical, Route 9, south of Elmore." The sound of movement, Vic getting up. At 58, Vic Tarr had been president of the Iron Compass Dayton chapter for 11 years, and before that had been its sergeant-at-arms for 6, and before that had been a corporal in the 3rd Infantry Division in a desert, and he had the specific authority of a man who had learned to move through dangerous situations by being more dangerous than the situation. He had also been Ray's closest friend for 22 years, which was a different kind of authority entirely. "How many people?" Vic said. 3 in the building, lawyer, and the Sterling woman, and security. I don't know what's outside. Sterling. Grant and Evelyn Sterling, private equity, Dublin, Ohio. Elias Grant is driving in from Columbus. He's got documentation. Elias. A pause. You called Elias before you called me. I needed information before I needed bodies. And now you need bodies. I need presence, Ray said carefully. I need people outside this building who look like they're staying until this is resolved. Not aggression, presence. Another silence. This one more complex. When Vic spoke again, his voice had the particular quality it got when he was working through something he didn't like, but had decided to accept because the alternative was worse. It's 5:30 in the morning, Ray. I know. On a Wednesday. I know. And you're asking me to pull the chapter together and ride to a clinic in... He paused, presumably looking at something, Elmore, which is 45 minutes in good conditions. Roads are clear. Snow stopped a couple hours ago. Ray, Vic's voice went quieter, which was always a more serious register than is loud. The last time you called in the club for something personal, this isn't personal. Everything you do is personal. That's your particular malfunction. A beat. What's the woman's situation? She's stable. She ran from people who had been using her as a vehicle for something they wanted. She ran to nowhere on a highway in January, and she nearly died in a ditch. She's got a daughter who'd been taken from her before she was born, if she hadn't run. And the people she ran from are in the waiting room with a lawyer and $40 million, and what I'm pretty sure is a structural pattern of doing this to women who don't have $40 million. Silence. Her daughter's name is Emma, Ray added, and he didn't know exactly why he said it except that he thought Vic needed to hear it, that it needed to be a name and not a case. The silence that followed was different. It had a weight that Ray recognized from 22 years of knowing this man, the weight of something old and unaddressed being consulted. Vic Tarr had a granddaughter named Emma. She was 4 years old and lived in Dayton with Vic's daughter and a husband Vic tolerated without enthusiasm, and she was the single most important person in Vic's world, a fact that Vic expressed only through an absolute ferocious protectiveness that he never articulated but which was visible to anyone paying attention. I'll make some calls, Vic said. Vic, I said I'll make some calls, Ray. Thank you. Don't thank me. And when this is done, you and me are going to have a conversation about what the last 4 years have actually been about, Because I'm running out of patience with watching you use the road as a substitute for dealing with your own. One thing at a time. One thing at a time, Vic agreed, not happily. 45 minutes. The line went dead and Ray sat in Dr. Vance's office, with the silence of the clinic around him and the smell of coffee getting stronger and the window going from black to gray to the pale, cold white of a winter dawn. And he thought about what was coming in the next few hours. He thought about Elias on the road with his documentation. He thought about Vic making calls that would pull men out of beds and onto cold bikes before 6 in the morning because Ray Mercer had asked. He thought about the Columbus number and the word insuring and what infrastructure that size implied about what Grant and Evelyn Sterling were actually willing to do to maintain what they'd decided was theirs. He thought about Marina in room 4, awake now. He could feel it. The building's quality had shifted in a way he couldn't explain, except that the rooms occupied by people who are awake and afraid have a different ambient pressure than rooms with people sleeping. He was standing to go back to check on her when his phone buzzed. Text message. Unknown number, different one this time. A 740 area code, which was southeastern Ohio. They have a county judge on call. Emergency order being drafted. You have less time than you think. A friend. Ray read it twice. Set the phone down on Dr. Vance's desk. Picked it up again. Looked at the door. A county judge on call at 5:45 in the morning. Emergency order. Someone who knew this was happening in real time and was texting him from an untraceable number to give him the warning. Someone inside the operation who was scared of what they were part of. Or someone running surveillance on the operation who'd found him as a variable worth protecting. Either way, the clock had just gotten shorter. He went to find Dr. Vance. She was in the hallway outside room 4, chart in hand, and her expression when she saw him was the expression of a woman who had just come out of a conversation with a patient and needed a moment to reorganize what she thought she knew. She told you, Ray said. She told me. Dr. Vance pressed her lips together. Mr. Mercer, the contract they have is executed and registered. Unless I can document a specific immediate medical risk to Marina or the infant, I cannot legally... There's a judge being called right now, Ray said. Emergency custody order. My source says it's being drafted as of about 10 minutes ago. Dr. Vance stared at him. A judge. Someone with a connection to Sterling's operation. Emergency order would supersede your authority to hold them here. We have... He checked his watch. Maybe an hour before it arrives. Elias Grant is a former AG investigator. He's on his way with documentation that establishes a pattern of fraud. If we can get that in front of the right person before the order lands, the right person, Dr. Vance said. Who is the right person at 6 in the morning in Elmore, Ohio? Ray looked at her. You have colleagues, people you went to school with, people who owe you professional respect, anyone in family law, anyone in the county prosecutor's office. You're asking me to make political calls before dawn on behalf of a patient based on documentation from a source I've never met. I'm asking you to make calls that might determine whether a woman who almost died in a ditch last night gets to keep her daughter. He said it evenly, without performance, just the fact of it. I understand what I'm asking. Dr. Vance looked at him for a long moment, the chart in her hand, the door to room 4. There's a prosecutor, she said, Lucas Prentice. He and I were in school together. He's been in the county system for 8 years. Call him. Ray. It was the first time she'd used his first name. She heard it herself, registered it. If this goes wrong, if your investigator's documentation doesn't hold up, I could lose this clinic. And if you do nothing, Ray said, you lose something you can't get back. The silence between them was the silence of a decision forming in real time. Before she could answer, the front door of the clinic opened and Ray heard it from the hallway. The specific sound of a door opened with authority, with the confidence of people who had decided that waiting was over. He heard Adler's voice from the waiting room, carrying now, no longer modulated for the small hours. We've been informed that a court order is being prepared as of this morning. In the interest of avoiding conflict, we're offering to proceed cooperatively, but my clients will not wait beyond 6:30. Ray looked at Dr. Vance. She looked at her phone. She made the call. 40 minutes later, the situation inside Coldwater Community Medical had reached the kind of tension that doesn't make noise. It had settled into positions. Adler and Evelyn Sterling in the waiting room, Adler taking calls on his phone every few minutes, Sterling sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the hallway with the patience of a woman who knew something was coming and intended to be present when it arrived. Ray at the triage desk, Kelsey hovering nearby, Dr. Vance in her office with the door closed and her voice a low, sustained murmur working the phone. Then the sound Ray had been waiting for arrived. Outside. Distant first, then building. The layered, overlapping thunder of multiple Harleys. Not one, not two. A grouping, 6 or 8, the engines distinguishable as separate, and then merging into that collective sound that Ray had been hearing for 20 years, and which still, every time, landed in his chest like a physical thing. Kelsey looked at the window. That's my people, Ray said. Through the front glass, he watched them pull into the parking lot. 7 bikes, headlights cutting through the pale dawn. They parked in a row along the front of the building, not blocking anything, not aggressive positioning, just there. 7 men in iron compass vests getting off bikes in a quiet, coordinated way, pulling off helmets, standing in the cold morning air with the particular stillness of men who had ridden through worse weather to be present for something that mattered. Vic was at the end of the row, gray beard catching the light, hands in the pockets of his cut, looking at the clinic building with an expression that contained everything he wasn't going to say. Ray could feel the shift in the waiting room behind him. Adler had gone to the window. Evelyn Sterling had turned her head. The security man had straightened in a way that was professional and also, just barely, uncertain. Ray went to the door and pushed it open and stepped out into the cold. Vic met him halfway across the parking lot. They stood there, breath visible between them, the sound of engines ticking down around them. "You look like hell," Vic said. "Long night." Vic looked at him with eyes that had spent 22 years developing the specific acuity that comes from knowing someone well enough to see past what they're presenting. He was looking at something that Ray knew was visible, the thing underneath the focus and the deliberate action, the thing that had been underneath all of it since Marina Hale had opened her eyes in room 4 and said, "That's my daughter." "Ray," Vic said, "don't." "I'm going to." "Vic, you're not doing this for her," Vic said, not accusing, stating a thing that was true and needed to be said in open air. "You're doing this for you, for what you couldn't do. And I understand that, I do. But you need to know that about yourself right now so it doesn't make you reckless." Ray stood there with the cold and the gray light and the sound of his brother's breathing around him. "I know what I'm doing it for," he said. "Do you?" A silence that had 15 years inside it. "Either way," Ray said finally, "she still needs help." Vic looked at him for another moment, then he nodded. The nod of a man accepting a position he doesn't fully endorse but understands well enough to stand behind. "What do you need?" Vic said. Ray started to answer. His phone rang. Unknown number, 614 area code, the same Columbus number from 4:30. He answered it. "You got my texts," the voice said. The same male voice, older, controlled, but something different in it now. Not the calculated distance of the first call. Something pressed. Something on the edge of breaking. "I got them," Ray said. "They know about Elias Grant," the voice said. "They know he's coming. There's a man, not Adler, someone else, who left Columbus an hour ago heading toward Elmore. He's not a lawyer." A pause. "Ray, they're not going to let this go to documentation. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Ray looked at the clinic door, at the window where he could see the silhouette of Adler on his phone. "Who are you?" Ray said. "Someone who should have said something 14 months ago," the voice said, "and didn't, and has been carrying that." The line went dead. Ray stood in the parking lot in the January dawn with 7 Iron Compass brothers around him, and the sound of a decision closing off behind him like a door with no handle on his side. And he understood that the thing he'd been holding at arm's length for the last 7 hours, the thing that said, "This is not your fight, this is not your life, get back on the bike and ride," had just been rendered entirely moot. Someone was driving toward Elmore who was not a lawyer, and Elias Grant was on that same road. Ray was already moving before he'd finished the thought. He turned to Vic with the phone still warm in his hand and said, "Elias is on Route 9 coming south from Columbus. There's someone heading toward him from the same direction who isn't a lawyer. I need 2 riders. Vic didn't ask questions. He turned his head and said 2 names: Decker, Moss. In the flat, carrying voice of a man who had given orders in conditions where volume and time were both scarce, and 2 men peeled away from the row without a word. Decker was 44 and built like something load-bearing, a former Marine who had the particular quality of absolute stillness in motion, like a gyroscope. Moss was younger, 36, lean and quick, the fastest rider in the chapter by the collective acknowledgement of everyone who'd seen him move. They were on their bikes and out of the parking lot inside 90 seconds. Ray watched them go. Then he turned back to Vic. "What else?" Vic said. "I need someone on the back of the building. 1 person, eyes on every exit." Vic chin nodded toward a man called Ruiz, who went without being told twice. "And I need you inside with me," Ray said. Vic looked at the clinic door. Something moved behind his eyes. Not reluctance, but the particular assessment of a man understanding a room before he entered it. The lawyer. And the woman. Evelyn Sterling. She's the one I'm watching. Adler's managed. She's not. What does she want? Ray thought about the way Evelyn Sterling had looked at the nursery hallway. "She wants the baby," he said. "But the way someone wants something that belongs to them, not the way someone wants something they love." Vic absorbed that. He pulled his cut straighter across his shoulders. A small, unconscious gesture, the way men who have worn a uniform straighten it before walking into something. Then he pushed the clinic door open and walked in, and Ray followed. The waiting room rearranged itself the moment Vic Tarr walked into it. Not visibly. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. But the quality of the air changed. The security man registered Vic the way security men registered things that fell outside the parameters they'd been briefed on, with a rapid recalculation behind the professional composure. Adler looked up from his phone. Evelyn Sterling looked up from hers. Vic stood just inside the door with his hands in the front pockets of his cut and looked at the room with the mild, absolutely unhurried expression of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone currently present. He did not look at Adler. He did not look at Sterling. He looked at the framed community health posters on the wall and the plastic chairs and the linoleum floor and the reception desk, cataloging the space with the patient thoroughness of someone who planned to be here for a while. "Mr. Tarr?" Ray kept his voice even. "Appreciate you coming." "Wasn't doing anything," Vic said. It was performance, partially. The deliberate casualness of it, the ease. But it was also just Vic being Vic, and the performance and the reality had merged at some point years ago into something indistinguishable. He sat down in a plastic chair with the settled quality of a large, calm animal, and picked up an outdated health magazine from the side table and opened it to a random page. Adler was on his feet. "I don't know what you think you're doing." "Sitting down," Vic said, without looking up from the magazine. "This is a medical facility. You can't just—" "We're in the waiting room," Vic said. "It's a waiting room. We're waiting." Adler looked at Ray. Ray looked back at him with the specific expression he'd spent 20 years refining. The expression that gave nothing back, that simply received and retained without offering any reaction for the other person to build on. "This is intimidation," Adler said. "We came in out of the cold," Ray said. "We're sitting down. Nobody said a threatening word to anyone. But if you'd like to make a formal complaint about bikers sitting in a public waiting room, you're welcome to step outside and find someone to make it to." Adler looked at the window, where through the glass 4 more Iron Compass members were visible in the parking lot, standing in the cold morning air with the patient immobility of people prepared to remain indefinitely. He sat back down. He made a call. Ray watched Evelyn Sterling during the call. She had not moved, had not reacted to Vic's entrance or to the men outside. She was looking at her phone with the same concentrated patience as before, but something had changed in the quality of it, a tightness, now, around the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there at 4 in the morning. The certainty was still there, but it was working harder than it had been. She felt him watching and looked up. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. In the silence, Ray heard something, a small sound from behind the hallway door. A footstep. A creak of a hinge. He turned, and Dr. Vance was there, coming through from the patient wing, and her face had a quality he hadn't seen in it yet. She crossed the waiting room to Ray and kept her voice low enough that only he and Vic were in range of it. Lucas Prentice is on his way. He said he'd be here in 20 minutes. He said... She stopped, reorganized. He said this is not the first time he's heard the name Sterling in a context he didn't like. Ray felt something that was almost relief, but was too cautious to complete itself. What do you mean, not the first time? He didn't explain. He said he needed to see Elias Grant's documentation in person. He said... She paused again, and this time the pause had something more complicated in it. He asked me if everyone in the building was safe. The word safe landed on the floor between them like something dropped. Why did he ask that? Ray said. Dr. Vance looked at him with eyes that had moved from clinical composure to something more honest. Because apparently, 3 months ago, a woman in Pickaway County who had filed a complaint related to a Sterling entity recanted her statement. Officially, she changed her mind. Unofficially, she stopped. Lucas said her family received a visit. The waiting room was quiet. The heater ran. The security man shifted his weight. Ray looked at Vic. Vic had put down the magazine. Ray's phone rang. Decker. He stepped toward the hallway door and answered. What? We found him, Decker said. His voice was compressed, the way it got when he was reporting something while managing something else simultaneously. Elias Grant. He was pulled off on the shoulder about 2 miles north. Ray. A beat. Someone already got to him. The cold that moved through Ray Mercer's chest had nothing to do with temperature. How bad, he said. He's conscious, talking. His car's got a blown front tire. Not a blowout. It's been cut. He's got a gash on his forehead from where the wheel jerked into a guardrail when it went. Moss is with him. But Ray... Decker's voice dropped further. His laptop is gone. His bag is gone. Whatever he was bringing you is gone, Ray said. There's a set of tire tracks pulling away heading south. Recent, before the snow settled. Someone was waiting for him. Ray stood in the doorway to the patient wing with the phone against his ear, and the waiting room behind him and the hallway ahead, and the specific sensation of a situation revealing its actual dimensions, which were larger and more coordinated than he had understood 20 minutes ago. Get him here, Ray said. Whatever he can tell us from memory is better than nothing. Drive his car if it'll move. If it won't, bring him on the bike. Copy. He hung up and stood there for exactly 5 seconds, doing the thing his brain had learned to do in the Army. The rapid compression of a changed situation into its new essential shape, stripping away the elements that were the same and identifying what had altered and what that alteration required. What had altered was this. Elias Grant's documentation was gone, which meant the evidentiary foundation that Ray had been counting on to give Dr. Vance and Lucas Prentice something concrete to act on had been removed. What remained was Marina's account, Ray's own testimony, and whatever Elias could reconstruct from memory. What had also altered was the scope of what they were dealing with. You didn't intercept a car on a rural highway and steal a laptop in the pre-dawn hours of a Wednesday morning because you were a wealthy couple anxious about a custody dispute. You did that because you had people who did that for you, and you had people who did that for you because the thing you were protecting was large enough to require that kind of protection. He went back into the waiting room. Vic was watching him from the plastic chair with the expression that meant he'd heard enough from Ray's body language to have assembled a working theory and was waiting for confirmation. Ray sat down beside him and said, very quietly, "They took Elias's documentation." Vic's jaw moved once. Took. Intercepted him on 9. Cut his tire. He's okay. Car's not. Material's gone. A silence that had a very specific quality. The quality of a man deciding whether what he'd agreed to participate in had just changed categories. "Ray," Vic said, "I know. This isn't a custody dispute. I know." Vic looked at the waiting room, at Adler on his phone, at Evelyn Sterling looking at hers, at the security man who was too composed and too aware, and who held himself in a way that Ray was now reading differently than he had 2 hours ago. Not private security, or not only private security, someone with a different kind of training underneath the professional composure. "What is it?" Vic said. Ray thought about what the voice on the phone had said. Someone who should have said something 14 months ago. The 3 sealed away women, the pattern, the infrastructure, the judge being called before dawn. The man on Route 9 who had known exactly where Elias Grant would be. I think Sterling's operation runs deeper than surrogacy fraud, Ray said. I think the fertility clinic investments are a front for something, or a component of something, and I think Marina walked into it without understanding what she was walking into. And now she has evidence, not in a folder, in her body, in what she knows and who she is, and that makes her a different kind of problem than a breach of contract. Vic was very still. She's not just a woman they want the baby back from, Ray said. She's a witness. She knows about the genetic material change. She knows there were other women. She filed, and even though it was sealed, she filed. She ran it 7 months, which means she has direct knowledge of the operation's methodology. She's the thread, Vic said. She's the thread that unravels the whole thing if she gets in front of the right person at the right moment. Ray looked at the hallway door, and they know that. They've known that since she ran. The baby is the leverage. If they have the baby, they have a reason to keep Marina contained. Lawyers, courts, terms of agreement, all of it creates a structure that keeps her from being a credible witness because she looks like an unstable birth mother who violated a contract. Vic pressed his mouth together. He put his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor and breathed through his nose for a moment. Then he said, "Where's the woman?" "Marina." "Room 4. And the baby?" "Nursery." Vic looked at the security man. "He's not here for show." "No. He's here to make sure the baby doesn't go anywhere that isn't toward them." "That's my read." Vic stood up. He did it slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried quality that he'd had in the plastic chair, maintaining the appearance of a man with nothing particular on his mind, and he walked to the water fountain at the end of the waiting room and got himself a paper cup of water and drank it. From that position, he had a sight line to the security man, to the hallway door, and to the parking lot window. Ray watched him do the geometry of it and felt for the first time in several hours the specific gratitude of not being alone in a situation. The hallway door opened. It was Kelsey, coming through from the patient wing, and her face was the face of someone who had been trying to maintain professional composure and had just encountered something that was making it very difficult. She crossed to Ray and put her back to the waiting room and spoke at a volume that barely qualified as sound. "Marina's asking to see you." She stopped. "But that's not—" She stopped again, visibly collected herself. "Ray, the administrator, Carl Purcell." She paused. "He left 20 minutes ago, said he had a family emergency. But before he left, he made a call from the back office. I didn't hear it, but afterward he went into the nursery." Ray looked at her. "He was in there for maybe 3 minutes, Kelsey said. I don't know what he did. I checked after he left, and Emma is fine. She's sleeping. Nothing looks disturbed, but..." Her hands were tight at her sides. "He's been here 12 years, and I have never seen him look the way he looked when he walked out of there." Ray said, "Get Dr. Vance. Tell her to check the nursery herself, everything, every surface. Then I need her to move the baby to a room that locks." Kelsey went. Ray turned and walked through the hallway door into the patient wing without looking at the waiting room. He heard Adler say something behind him and didn't stop. He went to room 4. Marina was sitting up in the bed the same way she'd been 3 hours ago, knees up, arms around them, but she wasn't looking at the window now. She was looking at the door, and when Ray came through it, something in her face that had been held very tight released by a fraction. "They're still here," she said. "Yes. I could hear them, earlier." She looked at him. "What happened?" "Something happened." He sat down in the chair beside the bed. The single plastic chair that every clinic room had, the chair designed for one visitor and adequate for nothing. And he looked at her and made a decision about how much to tell her based on his read of her. She was frightened, but not fragile. She was exhausted, but functional. She had run it 7 months pregnant across whatever distance separated her from safety, and that was the action of a person with more capacity than they appeared to have. "Someone intercepted the investigator who was bringing documentation," Ray said. "His material was taken." Marina's face went very still. "Taken?" "He's okay, but what he was carrying is gone." She looked at her hands. They were folded in her lap now, the knuckles pressed together. "So you don't have anything?" "I have you," Ray said. "Your testimony. Your knowledge of the other women. The Franklin County filing that happened before it was sealed. The filing itself is public record, even if the settlement details aren't. That's not enough." It's enough to raise questions, and the county prosecutor is on his way. She looked up. You got a prosecutor? Dr. Vance did. She knows him. Marina sat with that. She was processing something. Ray could see it. The way her eyes were moving without focusing on anything in the room, running through an internal sequence. Then she said, "There's something I didn't tell you earlier." Ray waited. "When I found out about the genetic material," she said, "I didn't just run. Before I ran, I made copies of everything I had access to. The original contract with my signatures, the amendment they presented me in month 4, the one I refused to sign and they said didn't matter because of a clause in the original, correspondence from their attorneys, and," she paused, "a recording." Ray looked at her. "A conversation," she said, "between me and Evelyn Sterling. In month 5, when I asked her directly about the biological material, she answered me. She explained it in a way that made it sound..." Her jaw tightened. She made it sound like an administrative detail, like the source of the genetic material was a logistical matter that had been handled to everyone's satisfaction. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't threaten me. She just explained it the way you'd explain a change to a meeting schedule. Marina's eyes were steady and very dark. "I had my phone in my pocket." The room was quiet. "Where is it?" Ray said. "A storage unit," Marina said. "In Findlay, Unit 114. The key is..." She reached up and pulled the neck of the clinic gown to the side. Taped to her collarbone, with medical tape that had been there long enough to have settled into her skin, was a small flat key. "I've had it there since month 6. I knew before I ran that if I left, I needed to have left something behind me." Ray looked at the key, looked at her face. "Does anyone else know about this?" he said. "No one. Not the other women from the Franklin County case. They knew I had materials, they didn't know where." She looked at him. "I didn't trust anyone enough. I still don't entirely trust..." She stopped. "I'm telling you now." "Why?" She looked at him with an honesty that had no performance in it. "Because you stripped off your club jacket to wrap my daughter in it on a frozen road and then sat in a plastic chair all night to make sure nobody walked through this door. That's why." Ray sat with that. "Findlay is 40 minutes from here," he said. "I know." He stood up. "The key." She reached up and peeled the tape from her collarbone, a careful, practiced motion, the motion of someone who had rehearsed it, and handed him the key. It was small and cold and had the anonymous functionality of a self-storage key, the number 114 stamped into the head. Ray held it for a moment, then he put it in his front pocket. "I'm going to send someone you can trust to stand outside this door," he said. "Nobody comes in who doesn't work here, you understand?" Marina nodded. He was at the door when she said, "Ray." He stopped. "The recording," she said. "Evelyn Sterling says Grant's name in it, specifically, in context." A beat. "And she says the name of the fertility clinic they used, which is not the clinic listed in our contract." Ray turned to look at her. "It's a clinic in Indiana," Marina said. "Sunrise Meridian Fertility, which I looked up afterward and which exists on paper but has no physical address and no licensed practitioners registered with the state medical board." She paused. "It's a shell." Ray stood in the doorway of room 4 with the key in his pocket and looked at her and thought about what it meant that a shell clinic had been used to source genetic material, and what that implied about where the material had come from, and what a man with equity stakes in fertility infrastructure and $40 million and the willingness to cut a car's tire on a dark highway might need a shell clinic for. He thought about the 3 women, the pattern. He thought about what the voice on the phone had said, someone who should have said something 14 months ago. "I'll be back," he said. He went back to the waiting room. Vic was still by the water fountain, now in conversation with the Iron Compass member who'd been positioned outside and had apparently come in without Ray noticing. A man named Cal, 50, retired Army Signal Corps, who had the compressed attentiveness of someone delivering a report. Ray came up to them and Vic looked at him once and read whatever was visible in Ray's face and said to Cal, "Go stand outside room 4. Nobody goes in." Cal went. "What?" Vic said. "She has materials in a storage unit in Findlay. Contracts, correspondence, and a recording." He said it quietly, close, Vic's shoulder a few inches from his. The recording has Evelyn Sterling on it discussing the source genetic material by name, including the name of a shell clinic in Indiana that doesn't exist. Vic absorbed this with his eyes on the middle distance, not on Ray, the way he processed information that required immediate action. "Findlay," Vic said. 40 minutes. "I'll go." "I need you here." Vic looked at him. "You need someone you trust to get there first." "I need someone you trust," Ray said. "Someone who can get in, get the materials, and get back here without being stopped. Clean. Fast. No history that can be used against them." Vic thought for approximately 4 seconds. "Hadley," he said. Tommy Hadley was 32 and had a law degree he'd stopped using after a disagreement with the bar in a different state. And he was the fastest thinking person in the Iron Compass Dayton chapter by the consensus of anyone who'd played cards with him, and he owed Vic Tarr a debt that predated Ray's time with the club. "Is he—" "He's in the lot," Vic said. "Send him." Vic went to the door. He leaned out and said one word, "Hadley." And the transaction happened in the parking lot with the efficiency of men who communicated in a compressed language developed over years of shared context. Ray watched through the glass as Tommy Hadley, 32, law degree, fast thinker, took the key from Vic's hand, got on his bike, and left. The clock on the wall read 6:22. The county prosecutor had not arrived. Elias Grant had not arrived. The emergency court order was being drafted somewhere. Ray went to find Dr. Vance. She was in the nursery, which she'd moved to herself after Kelsey's report about Carl Purcell, and she was standing over Emma's bassinet with a penlight doing a quiet, methodical examination of the infant's environment with the focused attention of a woman looking for something she hoped she wouldn't find. Emma was awake, big dark eyes tracking the light without distress, hands opening and closing in the reflexive way of very young infants, her small face carrying the complete unawareness of her circumstances that was both the most heartbreaking thing in the room and the most clarifying. Ray stood in the doorway. Dr. Vance clicked the penlight off. "Nothing visible," she said. "I don't know what Carl was doing in here. I've paged him and he's not responding." "He won't respond," Ray said. She looked at him. "He made a call before he went into this room," Ray said. "After that he left. He's not coming back." He paused. What would a person with medical access and 2 minutes in a nursery need to do if they wanted to ensure that custody proceedings went smoothly? Dr. Vance's face did something complicated and then resolved into something very still and very cold. "Document," she said. "They could document, falsify, an observation, a health concern, something that would require the infant to be transferred to a facility with better pediatric capacity." She stopped. "Which would take her out of my care and into a facility of their choosing, where the legal framework for transfer would be—" She stopped again. "Ray, if Carl filed a false medical observation on this infant, can you counter it?" "With my own examination. Yes, but if they've already transmitted it to the county health office, then we need Lucas Prentice here," Ray said. "Now, not 20 minutes." She was already on her phone. Ray stood in the nursery doorway and looked at Emma in the bassinet, who looked back at him with those dark, unaware that everything was happening eyes. And he felt the specific sensation of a situation that had been moving fast beginning to move faster, compressing the available time and the available options simultaneously. He thought about Marina with the tape on her collarbone. He thought about Hadley on a bike heading toward Findlay. He thought about the man on Route 9 who had known where Elias Grant would be. He thought about the Shell Clinic, Sunrise Meridian Fertility. No address, no practitioners, a name that existed on paper and nowhere else. He pulled out his phone and texted Elias. Shell Clinic, Indiana, Sunrise. Meridian Fertility. Everything you can find. Memory only. 3 minutes later, as he was walking back toward the waiting room, his phone buzzed with Elias's response. He stopped in the hallway and read it. Read it again. He stood very still. The text said, "That name. I know that name. It came up in an AG investigation I worked 8 years ago. Not fertility. Ray. That name was connected to a tissue procurement network. They were sourcing and selling biological material without donor consent. The investigation was closed. Witness problems. Two people who were going to testify changed their minds inside of a month. Ray read it a third time. Tissue procurement. Biological material without donor consent. He thought about what that meant in the context of a fertility clinic. In the context of a man with $40 million, an equity and fertility infrastructure, and a shell entity that sourced genetic material from a location that didn't exist. He thought about what you could do if you had that infrastructure and that money and that willingness with the biological material of women who had signed contracts and had no reason to examine the fine print for things that weren't in the fine print. He thought about 3 women who had filed and then gone away. He thought about the woman in Oregon with no online presence. He stood in the hallway of Coldwater Community Medical on Route 9 in Elmore, Ohio, at 6:30 in the morning in January, and he understood that he had ridden into something the night before that was not about a custody dispute. That was not even about 1 woman and 1 baby. That was about a structure. Elias had used the word, and it was the right word. A structure that used vulnerable women as material, in the most literal sense, and had been doing it with enough money and enough leverage to keep it sealed and quiet and legal adjacent for at least 8 years. And Marina Hale, who had run it 7 months with a key taped to her collarbone, was the first thread of that structure to have survived long enough to be pulled. Ray put the phone in his pocket. He went to the waiting room. Evelyn Sterling looked up when he came through the door. She looked at his face. And for the first time since he'd walked into this clinic 9 hours ago, something moved behind her pale eyes. Not fear, not quite, but its immediate predecessor. The recognition of a variable that had exceeded its assessed parameters. Ray stopped in the middle of the waiting room floor and looked at her directly and said, "Sunrise Meridian Fertility." The security man stood up. Adler's phone stopped moving. Evelyn Sterling's face did something that took 3 seconds to complete. A complex internal adjustment, the kind that faces make when a carefully constructed position encounters a pressure it hadn't been designed to withstand. And then it resolved into something that was no longer the composed patience of a woman waiting for institutions to align in her favor. It resolved into something that looked, for just a moment, like the face of a person deciding whether to run. Ray looked at the security man who had stood up and said very clearly, "Sit down." The security man looked at the window, where 4 Iron Compass members were visible in the morning light, and sat down. "Evelyn," Adler said, in a voice that had lost its modulation. She didn't look at him. She looked at Ray. And Ray looked back at her and understood, in the absolute clarity of that exchange, that whatever case she'd built around legal paperwork and judicial connections and the procedural weight of money applied to institutions, all of it, every layer of it, had just been standing on a foundation that the name of a shell clinic in Indiana had cracked through to the bottom. The front door of the clinic opened. A man in a county prosecutor's jacket came through it, rain damp, moving fast, with the expression of someone who had driven 30 miles in under 20 minutes and had something to say. Behind him, supported by Decker and moving carefully but moving, was Elias Grant. Forehead bandaged with what looked like strips from a road flare kit, laptop gone, bag gone, but upright and present, and already reaching into his jacket for a folded piece of paper he'd written on in the car. And somewhere 40 minutes away, on a road that was beginning to catch the pale morning light, Tommy Hadley was riding toward a storage unit with the number 114 on the door, carrying a key that had been taped to a woman's collarbone for 3 months. Ray Mercer stood in the center of the waiting room with all of it converging around him. The prosecutor, the investigator, the bikers in the parking lot, the woman in the charcoal suit whose foundation had just cracked, the baby in the nursery, the mother in room 4. And he felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Not hope, something harder than hope. The absolute cold certainty that this time he was not going to be too far away to stop it. And then his phone rang. Tommy Hadley. Findlay. Ray answered. "I'm at the unit," Hadley said. He was breathing differently than normal, controlled but working to be. "Ray, the storage unit's been opened. Recently. The lock's been cut and the unit's empty," Hadley said. "Everything's gone." Ray stood in the waiting room with the phone at his ear and the sound of that sentence landing through him like a current, and for 3 full seconds the room continued around him. Adler talking, Sterling sitting, Prentice moving toward the desk, Elias with his bandaged forehead and his folded paper. And Ray held all of it at a distance while he processed what empty meant. "How recent?" he said. "The cut's clean, no rust. Tonight, maybe last few hours." "Stay there. Don't touch anything." He hung up. Vic was watching him from across the room. He read Ray's face the way he'd been reading it for 22 years and was beside him in 4 steps. "Gone," Ray said. One word. Vic's eyes closed for half a second and opened again. Lucas Prentice had reached the triage desk and was showing credentials to Kelsey with the compressed urgency of a man who'd driven fast and arrived ready. Ray crossed to him. "They've cleared the storage unit," Ray said. "The materials Marina preserved. Contracts, correspondence, the recording. Gone." Prentice looked at him. He was 43, lean, with the particular worn-in quality of a county prosecutor who had spent a career in the unglamorous middle distance between what the law said and what money made happen. He didn't flinch. "What do we have?" "The investigator." Ray nodded at Elias, who was lowering himself carefully into a chair with Decker's hand on his shoulder. "Memory only. And Marina's testimony, and the name Sunrise Meridian Fertility on record as the sourcing entity in a tissue procurement investigation 8 years ago that was closed under pressure." Prentice's jaw set. "That name is in the AG's archive. I can subpoena that file." "How long?" "Hours, not minutes." Ray looked at the clock. 6:41. He looked at Adler, who had heard none of this but was watching the energy of the room with the alert wariness of a man whose situation had been stable and was now visibly destabilizing. He looked at Evelyn Sterling, who had not moved. Then the front door opened again, and a man came in who was not Prentice's deputy and was not any of Ray's people. He was somewhere in his 50s, compact and unremarkable in the way of people trained to be unremarkable, in a dark jacket without insignia, and he had the specific walk of someone accustomed to arriving in rooms and changing their dynamic. He went directly to Evelyn Sterling and bent down and said something into her ear, and whatever he said made Sterling stand up for the first time in 2 hours. Ray moved. He was between the man and the hallway door before the man had straightened up, and Vic was to his left, and the geometry of the room had shifted in the way it shifted when people who understood positioning took theirs. "Who are you?" Ray said. The man looked at him with eyes that were professionally empty. "Private counsel." "We have counsel." That was Adler from behind, his voice strained. "New counsel," the man said. He reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, showing his hand before it moved, and produced a document. He held it toward Prentice. "Emergency temporary custody order. Signed 40 minutes ago by Judge Harold Crane, Wyandotte County. The infant is to be transferred immediately to—" "That order was obtained without notice to the opposing party," Prentice said. He took the document, read it again. His face was controlled. "I'm going to challenge this." "You're welcome to," the man said. "After transfer." "No transfer happens in this building without my authorization," Dr. Vance said. She had come through the hallway door without Ray hearing her and was standing with her chart against her chest and her voice absolutely level. "That infant is my patient. I have medical authority over her care, and I am documenting a concern regarding her welfare that requires evaluation before any transfer. The court order supersedes legal custody," Dr. Vance said. "It does not supersede medical authority over a patient in active care. You want to take that to Judge Crane, you drive to Wyandotte County, and you tell him a physician refused to release a 3-month-old infant without completing her medical evaluation. See how that sits." The room held its breath. The man in the dark jacket looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at Ray. And in that look, in the 3 seconds of it, Ray saw the full architecture of what this was. Not a couple wanting a child, not even a fraud operation protecting itself, but something that had been running long enough and deep enough that a baby and a woman in a snowstorm and a biker on a winter road represented a genuine existential threat to it. He saw the calculation in her eyes. how much force to apply, what the exposure was, whether the people in this room could be managed or needed to be removed from the equation by other means. He held her gaze and did not look away. "Ray?" Elias's voice from the chair, quiet and urgent. "Ray, come here." Ray went. Elias had the folded paper open on his knee and was writing on it with a pen Kelsey had given him, his handwriting pressed and deliberate, the handwriting of a man working from memory with intention. He held it up. Written on the paper was a name, below it a position, below that, a number. Ray read it. Something moved through his chest. "She's in the AG archive," Elias said. "She was the lead investigator on the Sunrise Meridian case 8 years ago before it was closed. She requested the closure." Ray, he stopped, pressed his lips together. "I never understood why. She was good. She was the best investigator I worked with. And then that case closed, and 6 months later she left the office, and I never—" He stopped again. "Her name is on the original filing. If someone pulled that archive file and found her name as lead investigator recommending closure, she's connected to this. She's been connected to this for 8 years. Ray looked at the name on the paper. He looked up at the waiting room. At Prentice arguing jurisdiction over the court order. At Vic positioned between Sterling's new man in the hallway. At Evelyn Sterling, who was no longer looking at Ray but at the door, calculating. He took out his phone and called the number Elias had written. It rang twice. A woman answered. She didn't say hello. She said, "I've been waiting for this call for 8 years. Ray said, "Then talk fast." She talked fast. 90 seconds. Ray listened without interrupting, his free hand braced against the wall, his eyes on the floor, absorbing every word into the structure he was building inside his head. The structure of what had actually been happening and for how long and who had known. When she stopped, he said, "Can you prove it?" "I kept everything," she said. "Everything they told me to destroy. I kept it." "Where?" She told him. Ray straightened up. He looked at Vic. He held up one finger. 1 minute. And stepped to the hallway door and pushed through it and walked fast to room 4 and opened the door. Marina looked at him and read his face and sat up straighter. "What happened?" "The unit was cleared," Ray said. "Your materials are gone." She made a sound that was not quite a word. "But there's someone else," he said. "The investigator who closed the Sunrise Meridian case 8 years ago. She kept her own copies. She's been waiting." He stopped. "Marina. She says she can prove the full procurement network. Not just fraud, not just the surrogacy contracts, the full structure. What they were doing with the material, who it went to, how long it's been running." He paused. "She needs to get here, and she needs about 2 more hours." Marina looked at him. "We don't have 2 hours. They have a court order." "I know." "Ray." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm going to need you to trust me for 2 more hours, and I'm going to need you to do something hard." She looked at him without flinching. "What?" "I need you to walk out into that waiting room," Ray said, "and look Evelyn Sterling in the face, in front of the prosecutor and the doctor and everyone in that room. And I need you to say the words Sunrise Meridian Fertility out loud, as many times as it takes." He paused. "Because every time you say it in front of a witness, it's on record, it's documented. It exists in a way they can't cut a lock and empty out." Marina Hale sat in the hospital bed and looked at Ray Mercer and breathed. Once, twice. Her hands were steady on her knees. "Help me up," she said. He did. She stood, and she was steadier than she should have been, steadier than he'd expected, the particular steadiness of someone who has been running toward something without knowing it and has just located the finish line. She straightened the clinic gown. She looked at the door. "My daughter," she said, "is in a locked room with a doctor I trust," Ray said, "and 6 Iron Compass brothers between her and everyone else." Marina nodded. She walked to the door. Ray walked beside her. They came through the hallway door into the waiting room together, and the room reconfigured itself around the fact of Marina Hale being vertical and present and walking toward the center of it. And Evelyn Sterling looked up, and for the second time that morning, something shifted behind her pale eyes. Something that had the specific texture of a structure encountering the pressure it had been built to withstand and finding, for the first time, that the pressure exceeded the design. Marina stopped in the middle of the room. She looked at Evelyn Sterling. She said clearly and without tremor, "Sunrise Meridian Fertility." The room went absolutely still. "I know what it is, Van," Marina said. "I know what you used it for. I know there were other women. And I know that right now a former state investigator is driving toward this building with 8 years of documentation that you told her to destroy." She paused. "I'm not a contract. I'm not a complication you can seal away. I'm a witness. And I'm going to keep being a witness until someone in this room with the authority to act decides to use it." She looked at Lucas Prentice. Prentice looked at the man in the dark jacket, at Adler, at Evelyn Sterling, whose composure was doing something Ray had not seen it do in 9 hours of watching her. It was working, visibly. The maintenance of it requiring effort it had not required before. Prentice said, "I'm placing a hold on the court order pending investigation of the issuing circumstances." He looked at the man in the dark jacket. "You want to call Judge Crane? You call him. Tell him the county prosecutor is requesting an emergency review of an ex parte order obtained in connection with an active investigation into procurement fraud. See what he says." The man in the dark jacket looked at Sterling. Sterling said nothing. Outside, the Harleys were still. The brothers stood in the January morning light, patient and present and immovable, their breath visible in the cold, their boots planted in the snow. Ray stood beside Marina in the center of the waiting room floor and felt the weight of 9 hours and 15 years and everything in between pressing through the soles of his feet into the linoleum, and he breathed and he waited. His phone buzzed. A text from the number of the woman who had kept everything they told her to destroy. 20 minutes out. I have it all. Don't let them leave. Ray looked at Vic. Vic looked at the door. The man in the dark jacket took one step toward it, and Ray said, very quietly, in a voice that had spent 50 years becoming exactly what it needed to be in this moment, "Don't." The man in the dark jacket stopped. He stopped because of the way Ray said it. Not loud, not threatening in any theatrical sense, just the flat, absolute quality of a voice that had already decided how far it was willing to go and was no longer in negotiation about it. And because behind Ray, Victor had moved to stand beside him. And through the front glass, the Iron Compass brothers in the parking lot had oriented toward the door in the wordless, coordinated way of men who read a room through walls. The man looked at Evelyn Sterling one more time. Sterling was looking at Marina, and Marina was looking back at her with the steady, unblinking attention of someone who has been running from something for so long that the moment of stopping, of turning around and facing it, has a quality almost like rest. Nobody moved for 11 seconds. Then Lucas Prentice called the county sheriff's office. He did it standing in the middle of the waiting room out loud, without stepping away. His voice was level and specific, and he used the word procurement and the name Sunrise Meridian Fertility, and the phrase ex parte order obtained under false pretense. And by the time he hung up, the architecture of the morning had shifted in a way that no amount of money or judicial connection was going to reverse before the consequences arrived. Curtis Adler sat down. He sat down in the way of a man whose professional calculation had just completed itself and arrived at an answer he didn't like, and he put his folder on the chair beside him and did not pick it up again. The man in the dark jacket remained standing. He remained standing for 4 more minutes, until a sheriff's deputy came through the front door and spoke to Prentice, and then turned to the room with the expression of institutional authority arriving to find a situation already past its crisis point, and then he sat down too. Evelyn Sterling said nothing. She had said nothing since Marina spoke her words into the center of the room. She sat with her hands in her lap and her composure intact. Still intact, technically, still the controlled surface of a woman who had learned very early to maintain the surface, regardless. But it was a composure that had no force behind it anymore. It was just habit, the machinery of her confidence running on memory after the power had been cut. The former investigator arrived 17 minutes later. Her name was Carol Besh, and she was 54, and she walked through the door of Coldwater Community Medical carrying a fireproof case in both hands with the specific quality of someone carrying something they had been holding for a very long time and were finally, at significant cost, setting down. She went directly to Prentice. She opened the case. She spread 8 years of documentation across the triage desk. Physical copies, drives, Her own investigative notes and handwriting that had grown tighter and more compressed over the years as the thing she was holding grew heavier. And she began to talk. Ray stood back and let it happen. He stood with his shoulder against the wall near the hallway door, and he watched Carol Besh talk and Prentice listen, and Elias, from his chair, occasionally interject with the precision of a man cross-referencing what he was hearing against what he already knew. And he felt the particular sensation of a structure being dismantled, not quickly, not cleanly, but irreversibly. The Sunrise Meridian Network had been running for 11 years. The Shell Clinic was one node in a procurement operation that had moved biological material, genetic, cellular, reproductive, through a chain of nominally legitimate fertility investment entities, of which Sterling Meridian was the most recent and most sophisticated iteration. The women in the surrogacy contracts had been selected, Carol Besh said, with a word that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Selected, not recruited. Selected, because their genetic profiles matched specific procurement criteria that the operations clients had paid for. Marina's hand found the edge of the triage desk and held it. Ray watched her absorb that, watched her body process the information. The slight forward drop of her shoulders, the breath she took and held and then released very slowly through her nose. He had seen people receive terrible information before. He had received it himself. He knew that the way a person breathed in the moment they understood something they could never ununderstand was a thing you didn't forget, and he filed Marina's breath away in the place where he kept things that mattered. The county sheriff arrived at 7:50. Two state investigators arrived at 8:30, having been routed to Elmore by a call Prentice had made from Dr. Vance's office while Carol Besh was still laying out her documentation. Grant Sterling, who had not been present in the clinic, who had been somewhere in the background of all of this in the way that men who build structures are often absent from the structures they've built, was located at a hotel in Columbus and taken in for questioning at 9:15. Ray heard about it from Prentice, who came to find him in the hallway outside the nursery where Ray had been standing for the past hour. "It's not over," Prentice said. "Cases like this, it'll take months, maybe longer. The attorneys are going to fight the evidence chain. They're going to challenge Carol's materials. They're going to—" "I know," Ray said, "but it's not going away. What she has, combined with Elias's testimony about the original investigation, combined with Marina's account—" He paused. "The court order is vacated. Emma stays with her mother." Ray looked at the nursery door. "The emergency custody framework will need to be formally established," Prentice continued. "Marina will need legal representation. There are services—" "I know people," Ray said. "She'll have representation." Prentice looked at him, looked at the Iron Compass vest, looked at the hallway where Vic was sitting on a folded blanket against the wall with a cup of coffee that Kelsey had brought him, patient and present, and showing no particular interest in leaving. Cal was still outside room 4. Decker was at the far end of the hall. The building had the feeling of a place that had been held, the way fortified positions had a feeling after the pressure came off. Not relaxed, not at ease, but settled. Occupied by people who were staying because they had decided to stay, not because anyone had told them to. "You did something good here," Prentice said. Ray said nothing. Prentice nodded once, accepting the silence as the response it was, and went back toward the front of the building. Ray went into the nursery. Emma was awake. She was lying in the bassinet doing the slow, exploratory arm movements of a very young infant engaging with the fact of her own hands. A discovery that appeared to have been recent and was clearly engrossing. She was wearing a fresh sleeper, pale yellow, that Diane had produced from a donation box in the supply room, and she was warm and fed and completely unaware of the 9 hours that had surrounded her since she was found screaming in a snowstorm, which was the best possible thing about her. Ray stood over the bassinet and looked at her. She looked back. The same dark eyes, the same complete, uncomplicating openness. No assessment, no history, just the direct, present attention of someone for whom the world was still entirely composed of right now. He stayed like that for a while, not moving, just standing, letting it be what it was. After a time, he became aware that he was not alone. Marina was in the doorway. Someone had brought her a different gown and socks, and her dark hair was drying in the warmth of the clinic, and she was standing with one hand on the doorframe looking not at Emma, but at Ray. Looking at the way he was standing over Emma, reading something in it. He didn't try to rearrange his expression. He'd run out of energy for that sometime around 4 in the morning. "You lost someone," Marina said. Not a question. Ray breathed, in and out. "My daughter, 15 years ago. She was 8 months old." He paused. "House fire. I was in Germany. 3rd tour." He stopped again. "My wife, too." Marina didn't say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. She stayed in the doorway and held the frame and let it exist between them as the fact it was, not something to be addressed or resolved, just the specific weight of it, recognized and held. "Her name?" Marina said after a moment. "Claire," Ray said. She had dark eyes. Marina looked at Emma. Emma had found a new thing to do with her hand and was doing it with great concentration. The nursery was very warm and very quiet. "Emma's going to know your name," Marina said. "I want her to know it." Ray picked up his vest from the chair where he'd set it when he came in, and he turned it over in his hands once the way he'd turned it over in the waiting room 9 hours ago. The leather, the patches, the miles. He set it back on the chair. "She doesn't need to know my name," he said. "She needs to know yours. She needs to know what you did for her." He looked at Marina. "You ran it 7 months in January with a storage key taped to your collarbone. That's who she needs to know." Marina pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright, and she didn't look away. They stayed in the nursery together for a while, the 3 of them, the woman, the man, and the baby who had been found in a snowstorm, while the clinic continued its morning around them, and the winter light came through the window in the slow, committed way of January light that has decided to arrive regardless of how long it takes. Vic found Ray at 9:08, standing in the parking lot beside his bike. The lot was clearing. Deputies, investigators, the departed figures of Adler and Sterling, and the man in the dark jacket moving into the institutional machinery of what came next. The Iron Compass brothers were at their bikes, unhurried, waiting for whatever the morning called for. Vic stood beside Ray. They looked at the road. "Hadley's fine," Vic said. "He's at a diner in Findlay, eating his body weight in eggs." "Good. Elias is going to need a few stitches on that forehead. He's had worse." "He has." A pause. "Ray, I know. I said I'd have a conversation with you when this was done." "You did." Vic was quiet for a moment. The cold had eased slightly. Not warm, not close to warm, but the cutting edge of it had softened with the risen sun. The snow in the parking lot was beginning to show the first signs of the slow, committed melt that follows when the light decides it's serious. "She looked like Claire, didn't she?" Vic said. "The baby." Ray didn't answer. He looked at the road. Route 9 running south through the flat Ohio winter, the asphalt dark against the white, the line of it disappearing into a distance that was clear and open and going somewhere. "You don't have to keep riding away from it," Vic said. "I know that now," Ray said. And the thing was, he meant it. He could feel the difference between saying it and meaning it, and he meant it in a way he had not meant it any of the previous times he'd approached the sentence and retreated from it. Something in the 9 hours just past had shifted the internal geography of it. Not healed, not close to healed, but shifted. Moved from one category to another. From the thing he was running from to the thing he had carried with him into a winter clinic and set down briefly in a nursery and picked up again as something slightly different in weight. Vic put one hand on Ray's shoulder. One hand, briefly, the way men like them made contact, direct and without performance and quickly gone. Then he stepped back. "When you're ready," Vic said. "The chapter's still there." "I know." Vic went to his bike. The brothers started their engines in the staggered, overlapping sequence that Ray had been hearing for 20 years, each one distinct and then merging into that collective sound, the sound that was not one thing but many things together, which was the whole point. Ray put on his vest. He zipped his thermal. He swung a leg over the Road King and felt the familiar weight of it settle, the way the bike found its balance point as he sat on it, the way the handlebars fit his hands. He started the engine. The motor turned over with that low, even thunder, steady, present, the sound of something that had kept going through everything and was still going. He sat for a moment before he pulled out. Through the clinic window he could see Kelsey at the desk. and beyond her the hallway where Dr. Vance was moving with her chart, and further back somewhere, in a nursery with yellow morning light coming through the window, a woman was holding her daughter. Ray pulled out of the parking lot onto Route 9. He rode south. The road was clear, the sun low and direct, throwing long shadows across the white landscape. The Harley's engine was the only sound in a world that was very quiet and very cold and beginning, slowly, in the committed and unhurried way of real things, to thaw. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't need to know yet. The road was there and he was moving, and behind him, for the first time in 15 years, the thing he was leaving was not something he was running from. It was something he had done. The engine ran beneath him. The road unrolled ahead, and somewhere behind him, a baby with dark eyes was learning the weight of her mother's arms, and that weight would be the first thing she ever knew about the world. It was enough. It was more than enough. Ray Mercer rode on into the morning, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the horizon wasn't a place he was trying to reach. It was just where the road went next.